the opportunity to present here today and also to meet you, although it's obviously only online, but I think it's a nice opportunity. And my apologies for not having been able to join earlier. We are back to online teaching and kind of back to term, so there are lots of meetings also related to COVID now. But I will join for the rest of today. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see everything. This is, okay, presentation. Beginning. Okay, so this paper is about essentially the changed role of Southern and Central Eastern European member states in the common European asylum system, so in EU policies on asylum. And it actually fits quite nicely into, even better than I thought, into the workshop today, because it actually does talk about unintended consequences as well. And so I recently submitted to a journal, but feedback is still very welcome actually, and probably very useful because you're much more experts on Central Eastern Europe than I am. So the motivation and the puzzle kind of that was the starting point for this paper is that so we've now seen, as you will see in this table, there have been 3 phases of EU policy making in asylum. There was the first phase from 2000 to 2004, then a second phase from 2008 to 2013, and then a third phase, which is essentially sometimes called the post-crisis phase of 2016. And while there was a lot of actually institutional change between the first and the second phase, initially this was actually an area which was very much dealt with intergovernmentally. Since 2008, it's a policy-making area that's very similar to the most integrated areas of EU policy-making, such as the market, for example. And of course, also in the second phase, there were 10 member states that had joined the EU. But what is quite interesting is that if you compared the first 2 phases with the third phase, it's actually the third phase where you see most of the changes in the negotiation dynamics. And I'm here looking at kind of different behavior of member states, which is also taken kind of from the literature. There are the countries that are perhaps very keen on policies in this area, so that the pacemakers that kind of put forward policies and push for them. And that has changed very much from initially only being really a small group of member states from the Northwest with the traditional asylum recipient countries in Europe. And now we see in 2016, we see that actually also Southern European member states that are not really very active previously have become quite active in this. So they are also now pacemakers. Then when it comes to the group of countries that don't really care, the fence sitters, that has also changed quite significantly over time. In the beginning, it was really essentially everybody but these pacemakers from the north. Then when the 10 member states joined in 2004, there were actually, these countries became fence sitters. They didn't really care so much about asylum because it was not really a policy. I mean, they didn't really receive a lot of asylum seekers previously. But that group has actually shrunk again recently. And for the first time, we have a group of countries that really very much oppose EU policies on asylum. And that's an interesting mix of countries, including Austria, the Visegrad countries, and Italy is playing an interesting role, and I will talk about this later. So essentially, the question that I'm addressing is, why are the negotiations between the member states in the Council of the European Union, why are these dynamics so fundamentally different between the first phase and the second phase on the one hand, and on the other hand, the third phase? Why have we seen these changes? And the theories that I draw upon for this are essentially 2 theories. One, the core state power framework, which is from EU studies more generally, and I later then combine it with research on bounded rationality, also to address some of the shortcomings of the core state power framework. So what the core state power framework essentially says that EU policy making in areas of core state powers, and asylum would be a core state power in the sense that granting asylum really has to do with kind of granting access to territory and rights, and that's usually something that the kind of sovereign nation state does. And policy making from the EU side in this area is usually very different from policy making, let's say, in the market, because it's so sovereignty relevant. And so countries are usually not really keen to delegate sovereignty to the EU in these areas. And so the only thing that the EU then can do is try to have kind of adopt regulation, obviously with the support of member states, to harness national capacities. So you would rather have some kind of, let's say, a form of harmonization of policies, national policies, than an EU agency telling member states what to do in a certain area. And the coastal power framework then also says, okay, that often leads to suboptimal outcomes because there's harmonization of policies, but in the end, countries still implement very differently. And so there's no actual integration happening. And then at a later point, we have to take that up and reform it. And that's kind of the failing forward argument in EU studies. And I think that's very much something that we see in asylum as well, where implementation is really an issue. And so to overcome these problems, the EU would then, according to the core state power framework, have to adopt EU-level capacity, so something like an agency, and actual redistributive policies, although these policies will always already have redistributive implications, but again, this wouldn't necessarily work. And so what they usually say, what Genschel and Jachtenfuchs in this framework say, this only happens in situations of crisis. But that's obviously not really, it doesn't really allow for, let's say, explaining policy change, because, I mean, does every crisis lead to change? Not necessarily. And so that's why I draw also on bounded rationality from Jones and Baumgartner, where they essentially say, okay, governments never really have the full picture. They do update the information over time. They obviously base their policy making on some kind of indexes that they build, but they are usually very kind of ad hoc and not really based on all the information available. And then additionally, governments also update their positions depending on, for example, voter preferences that might change over time. And for example, if there is a populist government in power, maybe voter preferences that got them there are already very different from, let's say, a more kind of left-leaning government. Okay, so that's it kind of for the theory. In terms of methods and data, it's a within-case comparison. I compare on the one hand first and second phase of EU asylum policies with the third phase. And I engage in qualitative content analysis and process tracing, of which we don't see much in the presentation, but that's essentially what the paper was based on. And the data is EU documents, especially from the Council and the European Council, so really kind of the member states, and then interviews conducted over time, in total 57 interviews, also some from earlier research that I did on this. Okay. So kind of now coming to the findings. And indeed, we see that EU asylum policies are redistributive policies in the shape of regulation. And so there are essentially two types of policy making in asylum policies. There is on the one hand, harmonization of asylum policies, and then there is Dublin, which is also trying kind of to redistribute asylum seekers. And the whole idea of this, and this is also something you can see a lot in policy documents, is essentially to redistribute asylum seekers from traditional recipient countries in the Northwest to countries with low levels of asylum seekers, at least traditionally in the South and in Central Eastern Europe. And so the idea is policy harmonization will prevent people from eventually kind of moving from the South and the East to the North, because it's equally nice, let's say, in Greece than in Sweden. And Dublin, there the idea is really that border countries take the responsibility for asylum seekers that they have let onto the Schengen territory. But in 2016-15, we have seen that this did not work. There were still secondary movements from border countries to some northern countries, because harmonization was not really enforced. And the South was not able, and also did not really have a lot of incentives to implement Dublin, because it was really overwhelmed with a lot of applications. And so kind of the conclusion that member states took from this is, okay, we need better enforcement through an asylum agency, so kind of better enforcement of the harmonization, and then solidarity through a revised solidarity distribution scheme in Dublin. And so if we look at the first and the second phase, again, I mean, there we've really seen, as I said previously, the Northwest were the pacemakers, everybody else was fence sitters. They didn't really feel affected by EU legislation, because they essentially said, okay, we have not a lot of EU, or we don't have a lot of asylum legislation, we're not traditional or recipient countries, so we don't need this. It doesn't really it doesn't affect us. And that's something that will change this perception over time. Also, especially the South accepted a lot of policies that were not really able to implement. And the Central Eastern European member states were also actually quite open to accepting a lot of policies because they had already accepted many of them as kind of part of taking over the acquis when joining the EU. And especially, for example, Poland, I think, had designed its asylum system very much around, I think, the Austrian asylum system, because there were lots of kind of twinning projects going on. And you could really see in the beginning, okay, South and East did not really act as distinct groups, but that's changing in the recent reform, and that's kind of the focus now of the presentation. So in summer 2018, the reform, the new reform was deadlocked. There was a Bulgarian proposal on the Dublin regulation, and essentially the kind of big, let's say, a controversy was around the package approach. So on the one hand, the package consisted of a responsibility bit, which is essentially about an agency that then really kind of enforces policies, and a solidarity package, which is about kind of Dublin and redistributing asylum seekers. And the Northwest wanted the responsibility bit, so border countries finally implementing EU policies. They were not actually opposed to solidarity anymore, because there was some information updating going on. Initially, they were always, in previous phases, were very much opposed to giving solidarity to border countries, but they noticed that if they didn't do that, then asylum seekers would relocate and kind of engage in, or self-relocate and engage in secondary movements. So there was some learning going on among these countries. In the South, now they became pace setters really on solidarity. And they didn't give up on this, which is quite new. Previously, they would always say in the end, okay, yeah, if you don't agree, then we don't do this. But they have also learned that what could actually happen to them if they don't, let's say, fight for more solidarity. And so these countries also said, okay, we're not going to give up on solidarity, and we're not going to agree to any responsibility elements, let's say the agencies, unless everybody else agrees to more solidarity. So that's kind of a bit part of the deadlock. And then for the Central Eastern European member states, they're not keen on solidarity, neither solidarity nor responsibility, because they actually benefit very much from the status quo. And there was also probably some information updating going on, because they were also aware what it actually meant, or what agreeing to policies that led to redistribution eventually had meant for border countries in the crisis in 2015. So yeah, they are also not really keen on any policy. But interestingly, those member states that really blocked policies in the end were not necessarily all Central Eastern European member states, but on the one hand, the Visegrad countries, and on the other hand, Italy, which is also interesting because Italy plays a very interesting role in this. So they are very vocal. And my argument is that that has to do also, obviously, with those countries having partly populist governments that benefit also electorally from the deadlock. So obviously for the four countries, and they are very diverse, I'm aware of this, but for them, especially, let's say for Hungary, there was not necessarily much to gain from accepting additional asylum seekers, especially, for example, when Orban had said a lot that that the EU wanted to kind of impose adopting or taking additional asylum seekers onto Hungary. That's essentially saying, okay, we now give in to the EU. Also, some other Eurosceptic countries, again, might have problems with really agreeing to something that the EU set up. And then for Italy, on the one hand, they had fought quite a lot for this solidarity instrument in Dublin, but in the end, they said, oh, it's not going far enough. And the observers that I interviewed said essentially, okay, that was more or less a strategy that Salvini, the Italian interior minister, had used to keep the problem alive in Italy. So on the one hand, obviously, you say you want more solidarity, you bring that to the EU level, but then you actually undermine the adoption of this solidarity instrument then there is still kind of a perceived migration crisis, and who benefits the most from this? That's obviously the Lega. And that was particularly important because at the time elections were coming up in Italy. Okay, so yeah, that's essentially this. And then to conclude, so integration in the common European asylum system has shifted from regulating national capacities really to a physical redistribution of asylum seekers and EU-level capacity, which has really then kind of politicized the process and also led to some information updating among member states, especially among those that initially were not so, didn't really consider this a priority for themselves. The regulatory approach had helped to depoliticize the policy making, but but it also didn't really work. And what you see also is that member states have, and that really applies to all member states in the area of asylum policies, have a very instrumental approach to EU integration, and even kind of to calling up to have more solidarity in a way, because it always, so countries change their positions quite a lot depending on where they are on the redistribution of asylum seekers. If it benefits them, then they push for more integration. If it doesn't benefit to them, then they don't want more EU involvement. And I think that's something that's perhaps not studied so much more generally in EU policy making, is really the impact of populist governments. And I think there we see that really they don't always follow the same logic. So, and I think Italy is a very instructive example of this, playing in a way a two-level game and trying to, on the one hand, pretending to push for more or for a European solution on solidarity, but on the other hand, not really undermining the decision in the end and contributing to deadlock. Okay, thank you.